Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar that we are hosting today. My name is Rowan Terry, and with me today I have Silna Stain, who is the Managing Director of SSLR Incorporated, a property law firm in South Africa, currently trying to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic that is currently holding the world at ransom. Silna, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Rowan.
Good. Silna, as you know, obviously, the COVID-19 lockdown, specifically in South Africa, has been extended already from 21 days to 35 days. How exactly is this affecting the property industry right now, and where are we sitting as we speak?
Yes, so I must say the impact, I think the property industry is one of the industries that's most affected. I know that sounds weird because I think everybody in every industry feels exactly the same. I think every other industry believes they are heavily impacted. And the property industry, obviously, why I feel it's something that's heavily impacted is with the moratorium on evictions in South Africa, with the deeds office still completely shut down. We are all feeling it, and it's a very interesting time to be in the property industry because everybody is trying to figure out how to do things. Interesting to see the creativity coming from the industry, how estate agents are starting to show properties virtually, training a landlord, training an owner to take photos of the property, landlord to take photos to show the properties, but we're not able to move. So landlords and tenants are stuck in the situations where they are at and they can't move. And the truth is, with the extension of lockdown, a lot of people entered into agreements where they've extended the time period to take occupation, where the tenant was supposed to take occupation on the 1st of April. They've extended it to allow the tenant to take occupation on the 17th of April. And then turns out on the 17th of April, we were still all master chefing in our kitchens. So unfortunately, nobody can move. So no inspections, no moving. And until lockdown is uplifted, nobody would be able to move. So I must say it is, we're definitely feeling it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone is, but especially the property industry. I completely understand why it would be one of the industries that is affected the most. But you keep saying lockdown, and there's obviously a lot of words that are being thrown around between lockdown, quarantine, national state of disaster. What exactly is going on? Because a lot of people are also seeing that even if the lockdown finishes and ends completely on day 35, people aren't saying that this lockdown will continue, may continue afterwards. Will there be a phase out? What state are we in right now? Are we in a lockdown, national state of disaster? No one's really seeing the end of lockdown coming anytime soon.
Yes, so it's a very good question, and it's something very important to know. That so the big thing is the national state of disaster. So what that is the national state of disaster is something that's declared in terms of the National Disaster Management Act. So any national disaster, it could be a war, it could be a riot, it could be a natural situation like a flood or something like that, or a natural disaster like a virus. I don't think we've ever seen this one coming, but a virus that's potentially going to spread through the country as it does through other parts of the world already. So the National Disaster Management Act allows government to declare a national state of disaster. The moment government declares a national state of disaster, in movies, you've seen all those silly sci-fi movies about viruses attacking the world, all those silly movies where they're referring to martial law. So this is an American term. In South Africa, we don't have martial law. What it means is all the normal legislation, all the normal rules sort of go out the window, and this national state of disaster allows government to make rules and regulations, which is usually outside of normal legislation and could very well be directly in contradiction with the Constitution. For instance, in terms of South Africa's constitution, we have the right to freedom of movement. Now, we currently have a lot of things, but we do not have freedom of movement. So
Exactly.
it is allowed in terms of the National Disaster Management Act. That national state of disaster was invoked and declared on the 15th of March. What that does automatically, after 3 months, it lapses unless the minister uplifts it before the 3-month time period. And to be quite honest, I can't see that happening. Or it could be extended, and I must say, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can predict an extension on the national state of disaster. So long as we are in the national state of disaster, government makes the rules, and they are 100% allowed to, even when it is directly in contradiction to the Constitution. Obviously, there are some things that you can't ever contradict. It's not like your right of life, they can suddenly say, no, it's been real, sorry guys. So there are some parts of the law that you won't be able to override with a national state of disaster. Then as part of that, government decided to do a lockdown. So 100% close off of freedom of movement, the way we do business, all those things. And they are allowed to, in terms of the National Disaster Management Act, are allowed to do that. And the lockdown is simply one of the methods that government is using to try and contain this virus. So two very different things, and the national state of disaster will continue far past the lockdown. Lockdown might end, but like you say, we already heard last night that the president is saying we're going to do a phased out approach, which is pretty much, I think, what we've seen from the 16th of March until the 25th of March, 26th of March, where we were allowed to move and go to the shops, but you're not allowed to go to restaurants, not allowed to go to bars, things like that, to try and contain the virus.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for just explaining that difference, and it does put it into perspective that unfortunately life is not going to go back to normal anytime soon.
Well, I suppose, or ever. I don't.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to get used to a new normal, right?
Yes, exactly. With that as well, you've obviously implemented a few agreements from your side that you've been involved in drafting, being the rental deferment agreement as well as the deposit utilization agreement. If you could just give a quick background into exactly what these are, and then I have a few questions just to ask from the industry, just clarifying a few things on that, specifically from the extension of the lockdown.
Brilliant. So I'm very honored to be a part of this. We've had a long-standing relationship with TPN, Tenant Profile Network, and we've been the drafting attorneys of the residential leasebacks for TPN since 2014. So I know the contract quite well. It's like my third child. I really know this lease agreement very well, and I actually can say I really love the thing. I do put a big part of my life into it. But very important is the moment we realized, oh my goodness, national state of disaster, people are going to start losing money. Michelle Dickens, the MD of TPN, and I had a discussion, how do we help, what do we do? The drafting attorneys from the commercial lease agreement, Fullard, Mayer, Morrison, William Fullard, came in, and we've pulled together all the attorneys also from TPN and other attorneys from our firm came in, we pulled together, and we've put out these two agreements, the rent deferment agreement and the deposit utilization agreement. So the rent deferment agreement, there is one specifically for commercial that was obviously drafted by William, and then the residential, which was drafted by me. And the deposit utilization also drafted by me. There is no deposit utilization agreement on the commercial side of things because this is unregulated, so the parties can do pretty much as they please. Where on the residential side, we do have the Rental Housing Act specifically dealing with the deposit and how we can use that. So we did some creative drafting, and I think it's important to realize the contracts that we drafted was something that had to be done completely outside of the normal way we practice. And I think this is something that people really need to appreciate, that nothing that we are doing right now is normal, because
Exactly.
life isn't normal. And I think the most important thing to realize is it's not unique to South Africa. Actually, quite to the contrary, it is an international crisis. South Africa is lucky we're sitting here in our little southern corner of Africa, and we are actually looking pretty good. Our numbers are rising, and it is scary. But at the same time, if we look at the rest of the world, it could have been much worse. But I think looking at the rest of the world and knowing that we are a little bit behind them on time, and we are going into our winter now, I think we need to sort of brace ourselves and prepare ourselves for the worst, that this could carry on for a much longer time, even well into spring. I'm not saying lockdown, but I am saying the risk of the virus and the vigilance that we need to have with regards to this. So the two agreements are both pretty agile agreements, especially the rent deferment agreement, for this reason, because if I had a crystal ball knowing what it's going to look like and when the virus will say, okay guys, it's been real, cheers, it was fun hanging out with you, it would have been much easier to draft the contracts. But because we don't know, we had to keep it quite agile to put a landlord and a tenant in a position to negotiate. So I think the most important thing to realize right now is everybody is going to suffer financial loss. I have a lot of questions from the industry asking, but who should carry this loss, the landlord or the tenant? Every single person in the world. The landlord will definitely suffer financial loss. The tenant will definitely suffer financial loss. So will the employers, employees, everybody will feel the financial pinch of this. And I think that's the starting point. We need to move away from this strict rule of, but who has which right and what is right in law and what is. I don't think now is the time to enforce rights and laws. I think now is the time to call on humanity to just be human again. And especially with a principle like Ubuntu in our law, which says we need to consider the other person's personal circumstances and personal situation. Let's just be nice to each other. If parties work together to absorb the financial loss, everybody will get through this. Now is a good time to say #stronger together, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's also why our President Cyril did say in his address a few weeks ago, to say that unfortunately we all need to continue paying our suppliers, paying our rental, because it's just a domino effect. One person doesn't pay, that person, it begins to snowball. So everyone needs to come together to try and make it work. And I do believe that yourselves and TPN have really come to the party to try and continue getting the ball rolling in the property industry during this incredibly unprecedented time. I don't think anyone would have believed that they would be alive during such a pandemic throughout the world.
Yeah, it's quite something.
Yeah. But you say, obviously now with the second month of lockdown, with the deposit utilization agreement, what would happen now that we've gone into a second month of lockdown? Whereas now in terms of that specific agreement, you already utilized your deposit for the rental for April. But now getting into May, what is the situation now? I mean, you've already used the deposits. What is the next step?
Yes, so the deposit utilization agreement is really a last resort agreement. Remember, we're exposing the landlord to extreme risk with the deposit utilization agreement. It is allowed in terms of Section 53C of the Rental Housing Act, definitely is allowed, because the landlord can choose whether he wants a deposit or not. With the landlord deciding that he is willing to expose himself to the risk to use the deposit for payment of rent, it must obviously be done in writing using the deposit utilization agreement. My advice from the start, from release of the documentation, was, guys, this is a last resort document. It's really, that contract gets used only where the landlord has a fully bonded property, he has to pay rates and taxes, he has to service his bond, All those things have to happen, but the tenant has zero income. He's a commission worker, there's nothing, or he's on no work, no pay, whatever the situation is, absolutely no income. The only money and only liquidity in the transaction is the deposit. So if the parties decided to use that in April, obviously going into May, the same parties are still in the same financial position. So what the ideal situation would be to use a portion of the deposit. Remember, deposit is an amount, it's not one thing.
Yes.
So to only use a portion and still keep some money in the deposit for potential damages to the property, so that can be done. If it wasn't done and the full deposit was used, now the parties have no money left. The parties will have to come together and find a solution on how to go into May. The good news is usually your deposit would be sufficient to cover more than the expenses that the landlord would incur in a month. So I would hope to see that the parties didn't use the full deposit, or if they did, that the landlord didn't go out and stock up on toilet paper, but actually left the money to be able to pay for the commitments that he does have. If it was paid in full, however, and there's no money left in the transaction, unfortunately, unless the parties can come to an agreement now where they start making an arrangement to pay later, they, unfortunately, if the tenant can't pay, the landlord will have to place him on terms by sending a letter of demand. I must say, if they already came to an agreement to use the deposit, it would be silly now to suddenly put guns to each other's head with letters of demand. Then I would like to see utilization of the rent-affirmed agreement to say, listen, I can't pay a cent now in the beginning of May, but I'm going to start being able to phase in back into work through May. So I'm not going to pay rent for May, or I'm going to pay 20% rent for May, but I will repay you as soon as I start generating money again. So it's really now is the time to open communication and use the deposit, the rent deferment agreement going forward. Then, even if it means that the tenant is only paying 20% of his rent, let the parties then make the necessary arrangements to repay that at a later stage.
Okay, fantastic. Then with the rental deferment, specifically in that contract, there is a repayment schedule, which is obviously the deferred rental that has to be paid at a later stage. Yes. In terms of the agreement, it says after three months after the lockdown or national state of disaster, that date, then you can start repaying the deferred amount. Why exactly is that 3 months? Would you be able to negotiate a sooner date, a later date? Why, or specifically 3 months?
All right, so let me share my screen so we can actually look at the actual contract. I think that's going to make it easy. So I'm guessing you're referring to this part, item 1.9 of the schedule, am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so I'm going to quickly start on the recovery date, and that is a defined term, because I get the question quite often, Silna, what do we complete here in item 1.9 as the recovery date? Don't stress, it's a defined term. So the recovery date is linked not to lockdown, but linked to the national state of disaster, to your first question when we started. So the recovery date is either 3 months after the national state of disaster was declared. That would put us on the 15th of June. To be quite frank, Rowan, I can't see that happening, but we're going to have to wait and see. Or anytime sooner, imagine. Or any time.
One can hope.
One can hope. Or any extension, which I think we're going to see. So why I've put it on 3 months is as much as people will get back into making money again. Remember, I've drafted this contract before lockdown. So already going into the national state of disaster, people already started losing money. Because remember, restaurants are closed. Even though it's not in lockdown, social distancing is pretty much here to stay for a much longer time. So as long as social distancing is a thing, there will be some industries that really can't make money. And so what I've decided at the time before lockdown even existed to do 3 months after the recovery date. I think it's going to take that long. After recovery date, so after the national state of disaster has been uplifted, so life is back to pretty much the new normal, which is as close as we're going to get to the old normal. And I think it's going to take somebody 3 months to really recover, because the effect of this will be, if the parties agree that the tenant will pay reduced rent from April to the end of the national state of disaster. So let's, for argument's sake, say that the national state of disaster will end on the 15th of June as initially anticipated, or at least as allowed in terms of the Disaster Management Act. The tenant will then pay reduced rent for April, May, June. From the 1st of July, the tenant will then revert back to paying the full original rent in terms of the lease agreement. If that is the situation, only from the 1st of September would the tenant then be required to repay the amounts that the parties now agreed to, that the tenant don't have to pay. Because remember, rent isn't the only thing that the tenant won't be able to pay. So I do believe,
yes,
to give it a longer time period, 3 months to really recover before you start repaying, will put the tenant in a stronger position to go back to paying the full rent again as soon as the national state of disaster is uplifted, which will really make this much more achievable, because to draft a contract that looks pretty and everybody feels comfortable with is one thing, but to know that it would be able, that the parties would be able to stick and perform in terms of the agreement is obviously more important.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining that. Then a lot of people are asking the question with regards to this amount for the repayment schedule.
Okay.
It's specifically being unquantified. That can obviously be determined between the landlord and the tenant, if I'm correct.
Yes. So what we are doing, I'm going to show you the definition of the capital amount. The capital amount means the amount as calculated by the landlord at the recovery date, which will include all amounts unpaid in terms of the agreement. So the capital amount is unquantified. If we go to clause 5.1, we are specifically saying that the tenant is paying a reduced amount, and
Yes.
the landlord has the right to then, once we reach recovery date, to calculate the amount. So let's say, for argument's sake, Rowan, you're the tenant, I'm the landlord. I'm allowing you to pay 5,000 Rand a month less on your rental.
Sure.
So you're paying 5,000 less for April, for May, for June. So now you effectively owe me 15,000 Rand.
Yes.
We don't know that yet, because maybe maybe July has to be added to that, maybe August as well. So we don't know now if it's going to be 15 or 30,000 Rand. We don't know.
Yes.
So the capital amount is unquantified but quantifiable. So what we are doing in item 1.9 is the repayment schedule. We don't know what the parties must pay, but this is a formula. So what we are saying is, if I allowed you to short pay 5,000 Rand a month, you're deferring 5,000 Rand a month, which means you have to pay that 5,000 Rand a month later to me. If we complete here 5,000 Rand a month, because in item 1.4 you say what the amount is, or percentage.
Yes.
And here we are saying, what is the formula of repayment? So do I then expect you from the 1st of September to pay your full rental plus 5,000 Rand, or do I expect you to pay your full rental plus 2,500 Rand? What is the agreement between the parties on how you will repay? Because the truth is, to pay your full rent for a tenant that already struggled to meet their rental obligations, plus the deferred amount, I mean, the chances of sustainability is there pretty much zero. So I would rather have the tenant repay in smaller amounts, but depending on the situation between the landlord and the tenant.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining that. I've also got a few additional questions here from the industry. Number one being, is it possible to get a letter for the tenant just laying out these two options that we have? And how would you go around that process? Who would you be drafting that letter yourself? Who, as a landlord?
Yes. You know what, Rowan, the truth is right now, I wouldn't recommend a standard letter because we're not talking about normal law. A standard letter would be something like a letter of demand, a cancellation letter. We now need to open conversation. So I would not do a standard letter to explain the options. The truth is every rental agent, every landlord, every tenant has to understand the content of these agreements. The only way you're going to understand it is to obviously read through the contracts. We will share a link as well again to the rent recovery pack. It's free. We've made it available for free to the industry, and it's a click and download. We're not even collecting data or anything. So my recommendation is download it. It's free anyway. Read through it, understand it, pick up the phone, hop onto Zoom, and have the actual conversation with the landlord and the tenant. Because a standardized letter would typically have the opposite effect. That's like old day stuff where we enforced our rights
Yes.
and
Yes.
things like that.
Sure.
Right now, we need to open conversation.
Great. So you're saying that basically it's an unusual time right now, so rather go the unusual route and actually try and keep the communication going between yourself and the tenant.
Exactly.
And also, if you are a tenant, get in touch with your landlord and try and get some kind of agreement going, get the negotiations going, and come to some kind of agreement.
100%. And I think on that, it's important to note that there is no obligation on the landlord to allow you to pay reduced rent. So unfortunately, a tenant doesn't have the right to enforce this. He can ask, and this
Absolutely.
is why I don't want to see letters and things like that. We're appealing to each other's humanity right now.
Yes, absolutely. Fantastic. I think that's also quite important to note that, I mean, there's no directive at all to say that you do not have to pay your rent. You still have to, it's still an obligation. I mean, we have a directive from the president himself who says please continue to pay your rental.
Exactly.
So if you are struggling, get the communication going, get those channels open, and come to an agreement.
Exactly. And I think it's important to know non-payment of rent doesn't just affect your landlord. So you might feel like your landlord has deep enough pockets, but what a lot of people are forgetting is there's a rental agent in all of that as well, that as long as rent's not getting paid, the rental agent's not getting paid commission. So it's not the landlord that you should think, but the landlord has deep pockets, he can help me. Remember, there are a bunch of parties involved in all of this. Your rental agent, your managing agent, if it's in a sectional title, body corporate, rates and taxes, municipalities. The knock-on effect, as Mr. Ramaphosa rightly pointed out, is absolutely amazingly big. So we need to find ways to accommodate each other.
Absolutely, completely agree with that. One of the questions is, which has been coming up quite a bit, if I am a tenant who signed a lease and I was meant to take occupation on the 1st of April, obviously now with the lockdown, I'm unable to do so because I'm unable to move around during these regulations. With the extension now, obviously, would you be able to come to another agreement and say, I would take occupation on such a date? And what would happen with the obligation to pay rent during this time?
Yes, so that's a very good question. There is, as part of the rent recovery pack, also a document, an addendum to the lease agreement where the parties can basically do anything, specifically an extension agreement, because tenants couldn't move out. They still can't move out. We're extending the current lease agreement. Obligation to pay rent to the landlord that you are currently in the property where you are currently in occupation remains unchanged. You still need to pay that, and you still need to pay the full amount, or at least the amount that the parties agree to defer, or whatever the situation might be. Because the extension of lockdown now ran us to the end of May, and it could potentially be extended. I don't know. I'm not going to even try and guess that. But my recommendation to the industry right now is extend then on a month-to-month basis. Let's just give each other time to see what's happening, because the tenant that has to move out of the premises that you need to move into is also still stuck there. So let's all communicate and rather extend on month-to-month basis instead of trying to get prorated specific date things, because that's just going to drive us all absolutely mad.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So that would actually answer my next question, which would be, is the tenant obliged to move at a certain time after lockdown? Which obviously right now we're in such unprecedented times, and we have no idea what's going to come next. So in that regard, again, it's just keeping the levels of channels of communication open with your landlord and tenants to come to an agreement. And like you said, maybe continue on a month-to-month basis until we know for sure what can happen.
100%.
Fantastic. Then would, sorry, I'm just trying to get another question here. I've got quite a few. So one of the questions was, it's more of a practical example. The tenant has given notice, and they're utilizing the damage deposit to justify not paying the April rental. But there is a huge amount of damage to the premises. There's gutters, the walls have been affected, windows, gutters, everything. There's a lot of damage to the property. The tenant has now said that they're going to be immigrating in June, and they are going to be vacating on the 8th of May, and that they've stated that the landlord can utilize the deposit for damages, but they won't be paying the April rental. What would you advise in this situation?
So unfortunately, I would definitely not recommend the deposit utilization agreement. Remember, it's 100% in the right, the landlord's discretion whether he's going to willing to use the deposit or not, because the Act gives him the right to ask for a deposit or not. So in other words, to change the agreement to no longer want a deposit is completely within the discretion of the landlord by legislation. So I would definitely not recommend that the landlord use that deposit, because we know there are damages. So the unfortunate truth is the landlord's simply going to say, you know what, I'm so sorry, we can't do this. We can potentially enter into a rent deferment agreement, but then again, because they are immigrating, the chances of getting the deferred amount back is unfortunately very low. So if the landlord and the tenant can come to an agreement of reduced rental, where the landlord sort of makes peace with the fact that he's not going to get those money, those short paid amounts back at a later stage, I'm happy with that. But unfortunately, if the tenant and the landlord can't come to an agreement and the tenant is not paying, what you need to do is you need to get a letter of demand out. TPN made the letters of demand available at a discounted rate to the entire industry as well. So get the letter of demand out. If the tenant's not paying, you can cancel the agreement, even though they can't vacate now. At least we can compel them to vacate as soon as lockdown is over, and the landlord would be able to reclaim the amount. It's a tricky situation, the specific one, because the people are immigrating. So the best advice I can give is then just to ensure that the parties come to some agreement. To wait and see what happens is not going to fly, but please don't touch that deposit.
Okay, fantastic. Then also, a lot of people are asking about some clarification on the application of the Consumer Protection Act on residential lease agreements. Have you any comments on that at all from your side?
Yes, it's very interesting that the Consumer Protection Act is usually the act that's most talked about when it comes to rentals. And suddenly he's sort of, the CPA is lying far behind in the past. So very importantly, a CPA, 20 business days or any time period, still counting. So business days are still business days, even in terms of the CPA. So the tenant that's giving 20 business days notice of cancellation right now, he's still going to be liable for the penalty or the damages that the landlord's suffering, obviously in terms of the lease agreement. And if there's no provision for that in the lease agreement, for the actual damages that the landlord is suffering. So what tenants need to appreciate right now is there is an obligation on a landlord to mitigate these damages, meaning that he has to find a new replacement tenant as quickly as possible. The problem that the landlord has right now is he can't find a replacement tenant because his agent can't show the property. the new tenant can't move in. So the chances of mitigating damages for the landlord is pretty low right now. So for a tenant to cancel the lease agreement right now, I must say it's a bit of a, in terms of the CPA, it wouldn't be the wisest decision, generally speaking. I mean, there could be positions where it might be the best option, but generally, my recommendation once again is open the conversation with the landlord and say, listen, I need to cancel because my wife got retrenched. We're no longer going to have that income. We can't pay the rent. Can we please cancel? Negotiate around the penalty now. Don't try and enforce the rights, because it will definitely put you in a worse off position. But the 20 business days for cancellation by the tenant, or for placing the tenant on the terms, if the landlord places the tenant on terms, he still has only 20 business days to remedy his breach. If he doesn't, then the landlord is in a position to cancel the lease agreement. And if that is the situation, the tenant must vacate as soon as lockdown is over, and he will be responsible for holding over damages from the point of cancellation until he vacates the premises.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for explaining that one. And then last question that I have here, if one does the rent deferment agreement, how many months would the tenant be getting these rebates, these repayments? I know you showed us earlier the actual repayment schedule there. I think it was 5 months, if I'm correct.
Well, it's up to the parties. Okay. So the first part is, how long would the tenant be allowed to pay reduced rent? Well, as long as the national state of disaster is active. So for that entire time period, the tenant would be allowed to pay the reduced rent. But remember, guys, this is on agreement between the parties. There's no legislation governing this. So if the parties say, you know what, tenant, I'm really sorry, I can only allow you to do this for 3 months, the parties can agree to that. There's also a provision in the rent deferment agreement for the landlord to cancel the rent deferment agreement. It's very important to know that is not cancellation of the lease agreement, it's cancellation of the rent deferment agreement. The repayment portions will outlive this cancellation, but say for instance, the landlord and the tenant agrees today that the tenant will pay reduced rent of say 3,000 Rand a month until the national state of disaster is uplifted. But then it gets extended and extended again, and the landlord says, I'm so sorry, Mr. Tenant, I can't allow you to pay the reduced rent anymore. I'm not surviving financially. Then the landlord can cancel the rent deferment agreement, once again, not affecting the lease agreement, by giving the tenant 1 month's notice of cancellation, meaning that after the cancellation of the rent deferment agreement, the tenant will have to go back to paying the full rent in terms of the lease agreement. If the tenant then doesn't, then you place the tenant on terms by sending a letter of demand, cancelling the agreement, and then placing a new tenant. But I think landlords need to appreciate we need to be very careful at this stage. The rental market will definitely look very different after this. So if you have a good paying tenant, a good quality tenant, to have a lower rental income, to have a lower yield on your premises is honestly much better than not finding a tenant or finding a tenant that isn't such a good tenant. So I'm sort of really appealing to landlords to hold on to their good paying tenants and the good quality tenants right now. Hold on to them, even if it means everybody is suffering some financial loss. Rather do that than put yourself in a position to lose a very good tenant.
Okay, fantastic. Silna, you have given us some very, very wise words today. Thank you so much for your time and answering all the questions. If you have any more golden nuggets of wisdom you can give us before we go.
It's my favorite question.
So you go ahead. No, I was going to say, if you have anything more to give us, you've given us so much already. So thank you for explaining the property industry at large. Will definitely appreciate everything that you've given us and doing right now.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I think the only thing that I have is exactly that. We need to not try and enforce our rights right now. We need to appreciate that we are all going through this together. Whether you're a landlord, whether you're a tenant, seller, purchaser, attorney, conveyancer, rental agent, sales agent, anybody is going through this, and we will all suffer financial loss. And the old rule applies: when you try to hold on to something, that is when you lose it. So let go right now. We can't control this. We are not in control. We can control ourselves, and we can stay at home, we can stay safe, we can comply with the regulations, we can be calm, and we can appreciate that there are people going through much harder times. I got really sad last night watching the address by the president on the 21st of April. The mere realization that there are people that's getting 350 Rand a month to survive.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just pause for a second and not be sad about the fees and the commission that we are losing right now, or the rent, or our big salaries that gets cut. I mean, let's appreciate that there are people in the country that see a 350 Rand a month payment as the difference between starvation and living. So if we approach life with that approach, with that in mind for the next while, I think the world's going to be a better place. So if we can appeal to our humanity and see that we are all human beings, I think we'll get through this quite comfortably. It's going to be a pain, but change is always painful. But once we are through this, on the other side, I do believe the world will be a better place for it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tilma. Appreciate all your time, and keep well and keep safe.
Oh, thank you. You too.
Cheers, Tilma.
Cheers.